Shake your body now.
Let's talk about world federalism. Federalism. World federalism. Put your hands together.
My name is Eduardo Alvarado, and I am the president of Jeff Austria. And joining me today, we have two very special guests. We have Dirk van den Boom, who is a professor at the University of Münster and also science fiction author. And we have as well Liam Herbert, who is the organizing chair of the Young World Federalist. So I'm very much looking forward to talk to both of you. We are going to be discussing today one of my favorite topics, which is world federalism, especially starting with what is world federalism, what is federalism even, so even more basic than that. What are the common misconceptions of the world of a possible or probable world federation? What are the biggest hurdles that is facing? How do we actually get to a world federation? So I'm very happy to talk to both of you here in this talk. And let's start first with Dirk. So Dirk, I wanted to ask you first, what is federalism? And at the same time, if you can also tell us what is your relationship to federalism, whether professional or personal relationship with federalism. I'm very curious to know that.
Well, first of all, federalism is, if you look at the discussion in political science, a very complex topic because there are different concepts and different theoretical approaches towards it. And that also makes it very interesting if we talk about the vision of a world federation, because it is not a concept which is very static. You can have different kinds of and then discuss variations, and that makes it a very livid discussion. Basically, federalism is a political concept which says that in a political entity, we organize competencies and we organize authority on that level that is most befitting to this, what is the problem that needs to be solved. So in a federation, for example, you have a common foreign policy, but not necessarily a common educational policy in all the matters, or a common, there are issues on the regional and local ground where the regional and local authorities are much better capable of solving certain problems, and you combine these in a multi-level political system. But also federalism can be a strategy. It's a process. So, for example, if we talk about the different ways which we will do, how would you achieve a world federation, a global federation, then federating the world and the different regions at the first step before you are going to the next step of a global federation is a process. And therefore, having a federalism is not always only a static political system, it is also a strategy to achieve a certain goal. So it's both. For me, as a political scientist, I have always been interested as a defender of the idea of the European Federation, of the European unification, and how we do this and what kind of different scholars have to say with it. In adult education, where I have also been working for many years, the issue of European unification is always coming up when we look at the history and the workings of the European Union as it is right now. And many of the critical questions which have been asked in regard to the vision, which it is as of a European Federation, are exactly the same questions we can discuss when we talk about the World Federation. They're just on a higher level. So I think that has been followed me during my whole professional life as a teacher. And on the other hand, in my professional life, in my other professional life as a science fiction writer, well, you can imagine that the idea of a unified global Earth government is a very popular trope in the movies, in TV series, but also in novels, because it is seen by many writers as a precondition to effectively act outside your own planet. Now, for example, if you have the first contact with an alien civilization, it will be much easier if you have, in a construction of a novel, for example, a unified Earth government to deal with the more or less friendly aliens than having too many different governments, which is sometimes also the case. So it has also followed me as a very basic plot vehicle, as something which is very inherent into science fiction, because by many writers it is seen as a precondition actually to envision a future society here on this planet.
Thank you very much for the answer, Dirk. And you mentioned that you are, or you mentioned at least briefly the small steps that Europe has taken towards a federation. So I still think that we are quite far in many ways to get to a proper European federation. So I have, just before we move to Liam to talk a little bit more about the World Federation, I wanted to ask you, do you think, how far do you think we are from a European federation? And more so, how far are we from a world federation, so to say? So you mentioned Europe. How far are we then from Europe and also for the world federation?
It's a very difficult question to answer. And as a political scientist and as well as a science fiction writer, I'm always in the awkward situation that people are asking me to be a prophet. And I assure you that both political scientists and science fiction writers are most of the time not very good prophets. So, but having said that, and I have to prepare myself for that answer, I say that when we're looking at the European Union now as it is, we are in kind of a hybrid state. It is not just an international organization anymore, because there are certain competencies which are now on the European level. So in these areas, it works like a state. And there are other things where we are more an international organization, because there the main authority is still with the nation state, the member state. So we are kind of an in-between. And if you look at the scholarly discussion in political science, there are many who say that the European Union in its current form is a single event in human history, because it is neither nor, and there's no other like them. So we have a very special case here. But we are at this point of time frozen in this situation for quite some time, that there are forces in all of our countries who are against deeper integration, and there are forces in all our countries who are willing to pursue and continue this path of integration. And in the end, it is the outcome of this struggle between these two forces which will determine how long it will take. I think that I'm in the middle of my 50s now, and to be quite honest, I'm not quite sure if I will see the complete establishment of a European Federation in my lifetime. I don't know how long that will be. It depends on the developments in medical science as well. But in the end, I think we have to see it as an historical process, which is also always difficult for proponents of such an idea, because it might realize past your lifetime. It's easier for you, you're younger, but for me, it's increasingly difficult. And I certainly will not see a world federation because the obstacles are very high and there is need of a very persistent work. And there are many countries where you will not have yet something similar to a world or European federalist movement, where these ideas are very nascent. And I think that it will take some time. I've been working in Africa for a long time. And we have a tradition of Pan-Africanism in Africa, which has been started in the anti-colonial struggle. So you have kind of roots everywhere for this kind of idea. And the United States of Africa have been proposed by the Ghanaian independence president Nkrumah very early. So the idea is not restricted to developed states, if you still want to use that term, but it is an academic idea in many of these countries and has no roots in the common population. And these roots needs to be established.
Thank you for your answer, Dirk. And Liam, we move to you. So Liam, just to remind you, he's the organizing chair of the Young World Federalist. So Liam, can you tell us a little bit more about your organization? So what is the mission of your organization? What exactly are you striving for? And obviously, when it comes to world federalism, so what is your stand? What exactly do you do related to world federalism?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me, of course. Young World Federalist was founded in November of 2019, so we're still a pretty recent organization, but we've grown a lot since we were made. Certainly, the times have pointed a lot of people to us recently. So we believe in the creation of a democratic world federation, and our job is to educate and to advocate that. Education actually is kind of a key part right now. As Dirk was just saying, this idea has existed in academia for a pretty long time now, basically a century, but it is not necessarily permeated on the popular level, right? So that is what we're trying to do, is to build support mostly in the United States and Germany right now, but we're again growing quickly to other countries, and just letting people know this idea exists, because that's definitely the challenge at the moment, is especially outside of Europe, where there isn't as strong of this federalist movement, and certainly not like a European federalist idea. It's something that's still a little bit distant from some people. So just letting them know that there is this effort, and there has been historically for a while, to have greater integration between all states of the world is important. And the other part of that is, to many, it's intuitive. Just the amount of people that we have already brought on in the last year proves that it's a light bulb for a lot of people. When they hear about it, they become very interested and they want to know more. And that's something that's interesting. And it's also been very good for the movement so far.
Good, thank you. I believe in federalism, or the main reason why I consider myself a federalist is because I think it is the most feasible solution to the issue of concentration of power, which we have seen that has been I dare to say, one of the most common societal issues in the history of mankind. As soon as there's concentration of power, be it financial, economical, political, whatever resource that you can imagine, it seems like it almost necessarily leads to trouble and leads to unrest and leads to many other issues in a society. So that is, to me, what I consider the biggest benefit of federalism. But I'm very curious to see from both of you what is for you if there is a benefit outside of this one, or what are to you the biggest benefits that federalism can bring to organized society. So Liam, now we can start with you, and then Dirk will continue afterwards.
Sure. I mean, I think you make a very good point. And as an American, I'd be remiss if I'd not mention, we're on our second constitution, technically. We at first had the Articles of Confederation, which gave all the states a lot of independent power, and it fell apart almost immediately. We needed, especially in a country as big as ours, and even at the time as diverse as ours, needed another system. And federalism has more or less worked for the last 200 so years. So there's a clear example, certainly in my country, as to why you need a system, why you need a federal system, for sure. And the other part of that, again, is another benefit to it is having people work together that on the ground might have some different values or different priorities, right? New York State versus Texas or something like that, right? So just acknowledging that there is a level of commonality, of common stakes, in our case on a national level, is important. And also, as we have been drawn together more and more by globalism, the acknowledgement that there is a global level, that we are sharing a planet above all else.
I think that's a very good argument, and I think federalism is very helpful also in the way you are communicating that idea, because one of the major fears, and you have mentioned it, Eduardo, at the beginning a little bit, that people have when we are talking about a vision like a global government, is that it will be a very centralistic government. It will be something like a dictatorship. There will be no alternative. Once you have that one government and then something goes wrong, we are all screwed, more or less. Yeah. So the idea that you have to have an argument in order to say, okay, when we are talking about a global government, when we are not talking about a global dictatorship, we are not talking about an empire, we are not talking about an authoritarian centralistic state, or even if it's not authoritarian, even if it's democratic, you're not talking about a system which does not respect the rights of minorities, which does not protect the right of minorities, of small groups, of special groups, which does not allow deviating forms of of culture, of language, but it gives room for all of that. So whatever is your tradition, whatever is your history, this will not be destroyed by a federal system, but it will be in a way just transformed into a new bigger one. But that doesn't mean that the smaller one is automatically erased from history. And if you are able to convey that message in a proper way, you can address a lot of the apprehensions and objections people have, and naturally have. I'm not telling them that the idea is not stupid, because we have historical evidence that sometimes big political entities have a tendency to authoritarian rule. That can happen. Yeah. So it is very important as a federalist to say quite clearly, we have to implement safeguards for all these possible threats and problems right from start in the process. And there again, federalism is a process and not just the end product, because if we do not do that right from the beginning and make sure that negative developments of centralism will not occur, then we will lose the people who might otherwise probably support the case. So it is very important right from the beginning to have this in the discussion, in the way you are propagating the idea, because there will be objections and fears, and rightly so, and they need to be addressed in a public discussion. Otherwise, it's not possible to reach a wider audience.
That's a very good point, and I think that's a very good segue to the next topic, to what I wanted to discuss as well with you, which is related to the most common misconceptions that people have around a world federation, which in my view, the misconceptions are actually very much related as well to the misconceptions that people tend to have about a united Europe or about a European federation. Whenever I mention this topic, for example, to friends or to other people who don't necessarily agree with me on everything, they always see a world federation as the new world order, the ultimate dictatorship, to biblical proportions, even in certain cases. So my question to both of you again is, what do you think are the most common misconceptions about the world federation? And how do you think we can help fighting these misconceptions? So now we start again with you, Dirk.
Okay, thank you. Well, I can just follow up on what I just said. I think one of the misconceptions you have mentioned, that is this fear of a global, I wouldn't say maybe a dictatorship, but that's maybe too much. But there's a second one, and that is also very important to address. And because it is also not stupid, and it is also always, we have it very easy when someone is against our ideals, that we disregard the other idea as something that's stupid. We didn't think it over. That's very dangerous. I would always say, don't do that when you have a public political discussion, because you will alienate those who are ready to learn. and you don't want to do that. And one criticism which is always there, which is also a topic within the European Union, is so when we have a real European Parliament, which has real powers and stronger powers than the ones we have right now. It's already quite strong, but stronger powers, that the European Parliament is doing laws for everywhere, and a real parliament. What happens, and that is the fear people have against Germany, as I'm from Germany, and we are 80 million people, a lot of people who are going to vote, and we have a big share in this European Parliament. And what happens if the Germans will dominate it because they are so many? Yeah. Or if we have a North American federation between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, which means a North American Parliament will be dominated by the United States. Logically, if you do one man, one vote, then that's what the consequences are. So it means, again, we have to see on a global level, okay, if all the Chinese are voting for something, they have the majority in the parliament. If we have a world parliament, which will inevitably, in a way, be established if we want to have a democratic constitution. So, and these are reservations and fears we have to take seriously. And of course, then again, the idea of, okay, how do we represent minorities? How do we represent smaller regions? How do we make sure that the principle of one man, one vote is respected, but we also have a counterbalance, like the United States system where you have a House of Representatives and you have a Senate, and one is representing more the states and one is elected generally by the population. And the idea is they should counterbalance themselves. The interest of the states should be aligned with the federal interest. And we have the same system in Germany, and we have the same system in Austria, despite the fact that Austria is a much smaller country. But so we have to address this issue. And again, we have to convince that the safeguards we are thinking of, and that is why we have to think also in constitutions all the time, are workable and will be safeguards in the name of the word, so these kind of fears can be dissolved. And that is a very, very challenging task. It is a very challenging task because we are making assumptions about the workings of a future constitution we have not yet tested. We have it tested on a smaller level, and we are projecting this smaller level on a very big level. And of course, things can go wrong and will go wrong on that process. And we have to seriously and honestly address also things which might go wrong, because otherwise we will just be doing political propaganda. I'm not that very good. I'm not in for that.
Thank you, Dirk. And Liam, from your side?
Absolutely. You make a great point, Dirk, and that's why I say, as World Federalists, our job is more educational right now. It's about engaging with all of these people. I mean, YWF is a big tent organization. We take in people from across the political spectrum, and the way we talk to each other and the opinions that we share is a big part of the movement right now, because there is no constitution that we're holding up and saying this is what we're going to do, right? It's more than that. And as far as the misconceptions, I'd like to share. The 2019 General Assembly, I attended the People's Assembly, which had many civil society organizations. And something that an economist said to me there was, World Federation won't work because people need the government to be as close to them as possible. To which my response is, that's exactly what we're trying to do. International politics is already a somewhat anarchic and unilateral system. In America, we're just very used to the president completely kind of dictating what we're doing and how and things like that. But the idea is to bring those systems as close as people as possible and create a chain of democratic continuity from your local elections, your local town, all the way to international relations, right? That's really important. And the other part of that, and especially when we pitch it to Americans, right? Because in America, this idea is in many ways completely unthinkable. We're very secure in our position as the world leader, right? But a huge part of world federalism is empowering local politics, not just international ones, right? It's not about creating a top-down organization where that's where the government is now. It's about creating, again, this chain from local representation to international representation.
Great, thank you. So my next question would be, it's more related to, well, some authors believe that federalism is the natural agreement that different call it nation states or call it societies or call it cultures, that is the most pragmatic agreement that they can have whenever there's two nations or two cultures that want to unite in one, and there is one core that is strong enough to be able to pull the other nations towards them, but not strong enough to be able to dictate everything. So this is, let's say, according to certain theories, right? That natural agreements arise from that. So my question to you would be: do you believe that this is so? Like, this is the way? This is a natural agreement between two cultures or two nations or two states or two or more, let's say. Do you think there are other ways in which federalism can come to be? I just want to know, what are your thoughts more regarding to the how federalism happens? So we've already talked about what federalism is. We already talked about what are the benefits of federalism. So now I'm more interested to hear on how federalism can happen. So now we can start with you, Liam, if you want, and then we can move to Pierre.
Sure. Well, I'll say this. I mean, we're not pursuing world federation just because we think it sounds like a good idea, although I do think it's a great idea. It's because currently our planet is going through climate change, and that is an existential threat to everyone. So I think an inspiration for it is just the fact that, again, we have this commonality. Something has to be done collectively, not only just with climate change. The pandemic is obviously another big example of this, but in many ways, we have to actually work together to accomplish these things. And federalism is a proven way to do that, to have big entities work together on, again, those things that affect them all.
Right. I think I have a small problem when you talk about, and it is also a language ambiguity possibly, if you talk about the natural agreement, because we should be very careful in extending what is in nature to political developments, because then we make them inevitable in a way. So nothing is inevitable in politics. So I don't know if anything is natural. There are also people who say that in certain situations, having a dictatorship is natural to human society, because they are looking for a leader, and there's a crisis, and we want someone on the top to say what we need to hear, because we like security and safety, and we cherish that in some situations more than having certain degrees of freedom. So I don't like to use the word natural. It is for me, I think, more the issue of where is the role model. And we have in the European Union also the discussion, and that connects quite neatly, that if there are countries who are not willing to further integration within the European Union, then we need a Europe of two different speeds. We need one core Europe, which is coming closer together and maybe already forming a smaller European federation, maybe of only 5 or 6 former nation states. And then if this works well, then there is some kind of political gravity, and the others will see, okay, actually this is working better for them, so let us join. So the idea is not that bad. And you could assume that if you have these smaller working federations on a global level, that other countries will also look at it and say, okay, well, that's interesting. And we have happened that. So the European Union is a role model for many other international organizations in Africa or Asia, where they say, okay, we need regional integration, we need economic cooperation. They did this, let us model our own accordingly. If you look at the manifesto of the African Union, it is in some areas more or less copied from what we have started in the European Union, because they say, okay, we want to go there as well. We want to achieve that, and despite all the obstacles and problems they are facing. So I think the idea of having a role model and of having a smaller core, which then shows it's working and is attractive for the others to emulate, that might be a political strategy, but it also an inherent danger, of course, because if you establish this core once and then it fails for whatever reason, then the idea is maybe dead for a very long time before it can resurface again. So, but that's why I say it's not natural. There is no golden way. There is no safe and secure way where we can say, this is how it will be established. This is the good way. This is the only way. This is the realistic way, because there might be very, very different ways. And sometimes It is, as you have mentioned, the crisis, which kicks us at the brink, and then we jump away from the abyss just by doing something completely different very fast. And it is crisis is a thing that has always motivated humanity to take a next step. And also, I don't like crisis. I'm a very peaceful person who just wants to have his peace and live in peace. But we have a climate catastrophe. We see what happens if we have a pandemic, which is totally out of control. And many different governments are doing very stupid things in regard to this. And I'm not pointing at any specific government at this point of time. And we see what can happen when it is affecting the all of humanity. These are the kind of crises which hopefully will then bring into the idea of more and more people, there has to be an alternative way of managing this on a very rational and pragmatic level.
Thank you for your answer, Dirk. I have just a very short follow-up question from what you said. Do you think, does federalism in any way, or does any federally organized government, is there even a need for a core in the government? Let's say for a whatever thing resembling a centralized coordination body within a government, as for example in the United States or Washington is, for example, and maybe adding to the question, maybe appealing more to your sci-fi author curriculum rather than your political scientist curriculum. Where would you see a potential core in a potential world federation?
Well, first of all, I think that part of federalism is that you have authority on things which are, for example, in a global federation, which are global matters. And I mentioned the climate catastrophe, that is a global problem. So you will need, in terms for ecological politics, I assume, you will need global government and global governance, so global rules and regulations. And in other areas, for example, infrastructure, if you look at world transcending global infrastructural networks, you will need a global infrastructure policy. Yeah, so there are areas which are affecting everyone. And if I want to put my hat of the science fiction writer again, if we look at the efforts of exploring space and using the resources of our own solar system, why should we do everyone is on his own? We can do it much more efficient and saving a lot of transaction costs if we do that on a global scale. And pooling all the resources and technologies, we will be much, much further. We would be on Mars already if we would have started that much earlier. So there are many topics and fields of cooperation where I think you need something which resembles, in fact, world government and a ministry for this, a ministry for that, and a president probably, or a director or whatever, I don't care. And there are others where you don't need that. You don't need that, for example, if you set certain standards, you can leave everyone to have his own educational system. You just say, okay, but for that and that, we have certain standards. How you get there, it's your problem, but we don't need to define it for every region in the world, how you get there. So, and that is, I think, the level where we are talking about, where every federation has some pillars which are looking centralized. Yeah, but you have to define the level unto which they are centralized. And I think that will be necessary. But to be honest, I was always hoping that the European Union and a successful European Union, a successful European Federation will show the world that that's how it's done. Let's do it like that. And getting older and experiencing the struggles within the European Union as we have them right now, and member states which are members, but we have a very clear nationalistic outlook. My doubts have been growing. So at this point of time, I struggle to see a core, who will fulfill that role. I really struggle.
That's a good point. Thank you for the answer, Dirk. And now for my next question, I'm gonna be putting you a little bit on in the devil's advocate shoes. So I want to ask both of you, what are the arguments against federalism? So obviously, the first one that comes off the top of my head right now is the decision-making argument that a federalist or a federally organized structure would have, at least in the common view, would have more problems in taking decisions. I mean, we know already that's kind of like the stereotype of the eternal issue that the European Union has in coming up with a common decision. First of all, do you think this is a problem of a properly federally structured government? And secondly, do you see any other potential issues from having a government structure with federalism? So we can start now again with you, Dirk, and then we move to Liam.
Well, we have to be realistic. Once you have a lot of political actors, and when you have a federal system, you have a lot of political actors on different levels, then the interest of these actors always overshadows a bit the common interest. And that is totally normal. If you have a strong local politician, he is or she is very much interested in this locality and getting the benefits for that locality. And sometimes is also willing to accept that someone else will not get something because you get it. There is competition on political resources of any kind, and a federal system might be able to organize this competition, but the competition will be there. And this kind of competition might lead to decision-making processes which will be quite volatile and which will sometimes also put people against each other and raise arguments which are not very rational. And the more participants in the political process you have and the more levels who are involved, it might lead to political processes which are slower and sometimes which will need a higher degree of moderation and supervision in order to be solved. And we have in Germany this problem right now in the pandemic situation, that we have 16 small kings and queens, that's the governors of our states, and everyone is doing his own, and I think in the US it's not so different, that everyone is doing his own pandemic strategy, and it is not unified. And sometimes they say, we are doing it better, we are not getting a unified approach, and maybe a unified approach wouldn't be such a bad idea. So there are issues where you have to decide what is more important, the regional authority or the central authority. And that is why we have to be very careful in our argumentation, our arguments in favor of a global federation, because this question of who is in certain instances the one who is deciding, especially in emergencies, and why, that is an issue which has to be solved, and solved right from the beginning to make it very clear, because otherwise the negative argument, it will just be a lot of bickering about things because you have not come to a conclusion right from start how things will be done, that is a valid argument and it can happen.
Absolutely. And to use America as an example, again, the tension with federalism historically has been where those lines are, because sometimes it can be very much unclear, and that's become an even bigger argument in recent times. In federalism, and again, for instance, the southern states of the United States have always taken federalism to mean, so we can just kind of control basically everything, and there's a much narrower, focus on the national level. But of course, what they during the Civil War did not really understand is that it's not a state's right to segregate or discriminate against someone either, right? That is still, that falls into the more human aspect. So identifying exactly where that authority ends and others begin is absolutely the biggest challenge when we talk about this idea. It's the biggest challenge when we talk about federalizing just a country. So in a way, the argument stays the same regardless of the level in a lot of ways, and a lot of the same problems and the same pros and cons rear their head in the same ways.
Right. And we have the same discussion in the European Union now, where there are these people in Brussels, and there's this idea of these people in Brussels who are deciding things and no one is asking them, and what are they doing there? So we have this idea of a very centralistic approach, which actually doesn't exist. No one in Brussels is doing anything without the consent of the national governments right now. But the idea is there in the heads, that there's somewhere sitting there in Brussels making decisions. So and this image you have in the head is also the inherent criticism in regard to any kind of federating or increasing federalistic structures in European Union. And this argument will be much stronger even if you took it on a global scale, looking at all the inequalities different political traditions, different cultural traditions, the history of colonialism, which is in the mind of many people outside there. Think, okay, now we have colonialism back, just with another name. Yeah, so it's again the rich ones in the north who will dominate the poor south, or for example. So we have to take these things very seriously and into consideration, because there might be very big obstacles in the public discussion in regard to this matter.
Great. Thank you both for your answer. And I wanted to move on to my last question, which is about what do you think right now are the biggest threats to federalism? I mean, if we go into the European level, I mean, we obviously have, for example, what happened recently with Brexit. But I'm very curious to hear as well, what do you think, other than you can also obviously include the underlying issues that led to Brexit as well, of course, because I think those are very, very important issues affecting federalism right now. But I'm very curious to see, what do you think are the biggest threats to federalism right now? So Liam, we can start with you, and then we continue with Dirk.
Sure. I mean, it's undeniable. There's been a huge rise in nationalism across the world right now. And I've seen it in my country, and I'm sure you've seen it in yours. People are becoming increasingly of the idea that since the world is so complicated, it's kind of better if you just don't engage with it, right? That somehow there's this magical off button that if you just focus on your one state or your one country, the outside world will have no effect on you. And then that's somehow a voluntary decision, but it's not. And that in itself is the misconception that is quickly becoming obviously a hindrance to world federalism, to European federalism. And I wish I had a clear answer on exactly the ways past that, but it is definitely a big obstacle.
It is. I totally agree with you. And what we have seen in Brexit, and not only in Brexit, is that, and that is the example of the European Union, is that people who are born into this integration project are taking things for granted. And they do not reflect on the fact, again, that this has been a struggle to achieve. For example, the peace in Europe, which has not been a case in all the centuries before the Second World War. It is a very recent development that we have peace in Europe, and that I can go to France to the supermarket and go shopping there and go back and no one is killing me. I mean, that is really, it is historically a new development, but we are taking it for granted. We're taking it for granted because we have been raised in this environment. And one of the biggest problems of Brexit is that many people who have voted for the Brexit have not considered that many of the benefits they have reaped from the European Union were a little bit, well, I wouldn't say you couldn't see them always, but they were kind of the background and the foundation of many economic processes, for example. And now as Brexit is happening, they suddenly see what is breaking away, what is dissolving, because this foundation is not existing anymore, which was not visible for them in the first place, and they didn't consider it when they made a decision. And that is, I think, a very, very big problem. And you talked about the off switch. The world has become a very complex place, increasingly so as we are now getting information instantly about everything that is happening in the world if we open our eyes. And sometimes it's wrong information. It's fake news. The fake news exists. It's not just an invention of Mr. Trump. He just defined it differently. But we are overwhelmed with information. And which clearly shows us how complex it is what is happening, and then this reflex to concentrate on what you have and say shut the rest out is for many people a logical conclusion, because they just don't understand anymore what is happening. Because there's so much happening, and that is, for me, we come back to the issue of education. We have to learn to deal with a complex world. We have to be able to define what we are dealing with and who is dealing with what, and how do we understand this? How do we manage information? Because information is the basis for every political decision, long-term, medium-term, or long-term. And that is, for me, the core issue. Whatever you want to achieve as a vision in the future political, if you know how to organize information and how you deal with that, it has also an impact on the stability of that project in the future, because I think that is in our age, in our digital age, is information. organization and the manipulation of information, that is the battleground on which also political systems and their viability is decided.
Great. Thank you very much to both of you for giving us your insights on what world federalism is, and also Liam, from your side as well, what your organization is doing towards the world achieving a world federation. So I'm very thankful to both of you for this talk today, and thank you very much everyone for watching, and see you next time.
Let's talk about world federalism. Federalism.